Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. I'm your still sickly sounding host, Jackson. And in today's episode, we're talking to Arun Daniel, who is a historian all about his work redefining Eneolithic human-horse interactions in Central Eurasia. This was a really fascinating conversation with Arun as we discussed various different ways of taming and domesticating horses, co-domestication between horses and humans, but also the importance of archaeology within these studies. I know you're really going to love listening to Arun talk about these different topics and exploring them with him, because it's something that it's a very different topic, but it's nonetheless an important one to learn about. Now, if you enjoy the topics and conversations that we have here at History Jackson, please do consider heading to History Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts or the Buy Me a Coffee profile in the description below to continue to support us. Now, without further ado, I'll leave you with Arun. So hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. Today we're talking to historian Arun Daniel about his article, Redefining Eneolithic Human-Horse Interactions in Central Eurasia. How you doing, Arun?
I'm great, thanks. I'm great. Nice to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on. I'm really excited to talk about something which I think is often, well, not even often ignored, hardly known, and I think it's an important topic for us to discuss today.
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, even for me, like when I was looking into this, there's things that I was like, whoa. It's always really enriching, I think, when you start looking at different cultures around the world and their own relationship to an animal maybe we take for granted, or think that there's only maybe a few modes of interaction with.
No, I certainly agree in terms of the horses. I think a lot of people do take them for granted, but I wanna dive down there a little bit. You know, what was the inspiration for you wanting to write this piece? Because obviously it's a very specific study, but an incredibly interesting one.
I think it was sort of like a niggling thing in the back of my mind for a while, and I suppose it was sort of in feasibility of what sort of research could I find, how could I find it, was there enough documented evidence of the things I already knew a little bit about. And it just took a while to sort of galvanize all of those different research strands. But I think the things that were really sort of encouraging me, motivating me to do it was, I suppose, my personal link is my granddad. So he used to train horses. He was a good old Irishman, and he looked after a bunch of horses in the stables for some lord and lady in the West Country, and I cannot remember their name. But yeah, so he was in the stables every day till the day he died, really. And he was always a stickler for not being so strict with them. This sort of domineering, almost sort of like, terrifying them into submission kind of techniques, which I think used to be more popular, but isn't as much today. But yeah, he was very much about just being on the same level as the animal, trying to sort of afford it a bit more agency. So yeah, he was against the whole sort of punishment and discipline approach, which I think at the time was quite popular. Certainly, if you're training horses for the races and such things. And then the other thing that was probably it comes from sort of a more general theme, which is I'm just really interested in how humans have their sort of relationship with nature has evolved throughout the millennia. How it's changed in different parts of the world with different groups. How you have individual approaches, you have sort of group dynamics, and also how we got where we are today, and what we're doing with nature today, which I think is probably enough to say at the moment isn't so great. So I suppose for me, I was just wanting to look at different alternatives, different ways that are maybe, maybe a bit more respectful, or a little bit more appreciative of what we have around us. Yeah, so I think those are two main things that were really sort of fueling me. But also, I think the idea of domestication is something that just bugged me for a bit. because it's always seen as something that's quite a one-sided, top-down, what we do to the thing, quite a mechanical sort of approach. Press a button, you get a response. You sort of add these ingredients, you get the formula. Ta-da! It's a domesticated animal. As if you're making a car. And I don't feel personally, certainly not with my interactions with animals throughout my life, that that's how it works. There's always been a give and take. There's always been an agency in both parties. There's been a sort of fluid dynamic, even if it's just, interacting with a friend's pet cat. They've all got their own personalities, but even that personality is something that I think can also factor in certain animals' interactions as well. So I suppose I just wanted to see if it actually holds up to scrutiny, and certainly in terms of horses, where the evidence is sort of multivocal, it isn't absolute. There's a lot of indirect evidence for certain things, and there's a lot of theories, and they seem to be changing, as much as the wind changes or the weather, certainly in England. So yeah, I think that's kind of a long-winded version.
I think it's really nice how you came into it. As we see with a lot of historians, it's a family member gets you interested in one thing, and then your general interest in wanting to explore something even further takes you to want to explore that to a different level. And I think it's really nice that you're able to mesh those. But I do certainly agree that, I've got 2 dogs here and a cat. Their 3 personalities are incredibly different. And even though they're domesticated, you the way that you interact with each of those animals is very different, and it's incredibly interesting to think about how different people across the millennia have interacted with their animals. But I want to ask, why do you think it's important for us to study the history and the role of horses in society? I know we've touched on it a little bit, but at the moment in society, horses don't have such a big role anymore compared to what they've had for the past millennia.
Well, I think that brings on to the sort of the things that already we always talk about in terms of horses, warfare or transportation. Those are the things that they were integral to up until, well, in some countries they still are. Maybe not warfare, but certainly transportation. And in certainly in our neck of the woods, probably up until even 50, 60 years ago in some parts of this country, still powering industry. But I think it's because it's such a sensitive animal. It's not a predatory animal. That's another interesting thing, right? Like there's quite a lot of domesticated animals which can be sort of the predatory type that we interact with in a social way, that we include within our group. Then there's domesticated animals which are the prey type, which we may want to put into a box, put into a cage, milk it, get eggs from it, slice it up and do a kind of thing with it and take what we want. And I think that those sorts of distinctions can be a little blurred when you look at horses, because some suggestions are that they were initially domesticated primarily for secondary use, not primary use. Some believe that it was because of wanted to have like a firm, stable source of meat. But I think there's a lot more theories that suggest, it's primarily for transportation. It's because of their use and functionality. It's because of them producing milk. It's producing things like that. It's something that could be ridden. That's something we can talk about later. How the hell do you get the idea of jumping on the back of this thing? Whoever the first person was to do that, that would have been a fun thing to watch. But I think it's like I see it as a barometer for, maybe this is sort of a bit sort of blasé, but like as a barometer for society, how this animal has been utilized over the last 3, 4, 5,000 years can sometimes reflect where we're at as human beings and what we are trying to do in the world. And yeah, a lot of historical narratives tend to say, it was the horse that, powered this. It was the horse that did that, but it's more like our use of the horse that did that. And there's this kind of myth as well that, anyone who sits on a horse with a sword is invincible, right? You can't knock them out. You can't take them out. That's it, as if it's like some sort of primitive form of a tank, unstoppable. And, there's a lot of issues with that as well, I think. But these kinds of things that I think we're taking for granted historically, archaeologically, socially as well. And yeah, because they're not integral to the sort of practicalities of life, but they are integral to entertainment. Horse racing brings in billions of pounds or dollars, depending where you are, every year. And they're seen as a prestige animal, right? They're put on this sort of status that's different to other animals. And it's something that's quite a unique sort of evolution of an animal throughout the ages and to how it's gotten to where it is today. But then there's other things that sort of have come up for me as well, which is, looking into the genetics of things, looking into breeding practices. There's a lot of issues with the way that we breed animals today, in terms of that diversity genetically. And certainly in horses, these are kind of like closed gene pools. These are animals that we're trying to get the best sporting animal out of, but in the process of doing that, we're kind of like limiting its ability to, to change, to adapt, all sorts of things. So you get, genes that are popping up that aren't particularly healthy. You get generations of horses that develop illnesses and diseases, and this is all for our desire to fulfill what we want, that makes us feel, I don't know, whatever, good or something like that. Getting our racing going, gambling, stuff like that. I mean, of course, there's other places in the world where that's not the case, but I suppose I'm mainly talking about the Western world here. So those are other issues that I think have come up for me, which is just animal welfare as a whole. As I said, it's changing. It's far more sort of self-reflexive today than it used to be maybe 10 years ago, even, I suppose. But those things are, I think, are really, really problematic, if we don't address them, because it's something we take for granted, something that then is put on into another animal. I mean, let's just look at the use of dairy animals, how we look after our chickens in various parts of the country, parts of the world. They're all kind of the way that we perceive the animal, how useful it is to us. And I think it's that idea of utility that's something I really want to question. Is that the only way? And is that the healthiest way for us as well?
No,
So,
it's interesting to hear, that servant master kind of role within those relationships across multiple animals, particularly in the development of the role of the horse. Now, your paper mainly focuses on Central Eurasia, and when you were talking about reasons for domestication of the horses, were those reasons the same reasons for people in Central Eurasia?
well, that's a very, very, very good question, because that brings us on to, as well, the way I see looking at the past is that sometimes we have to be very self-aware of where we're at in the present, right? That self-reflexivity to know if we're putting some bias on the past, but also why we want to know. Why is it that we want to dig up that dead person's grave? Someone buried their dad like that. This is something that's very important to somebody. I mean, even with these horses, these things were buried in some of these parts of the world. Why is it that we want to find out this information? Is it to relate, or is it to compare, or is it genuinely for the sort of like increasing of our knowledge? There's always an agenda. It doesn't always have to be negative, but there's always a reason why. Certainly like my reason for wanting to look at this. And I think once we look at that, we can quite clearly see our reasons for wanting to ride horses today. And then looking at what could be in the past, I think it's a could be. And I think that that's probably more important than giving a definitive, because that's the sort of flexibility of the range of interactions possible. We live in a very, a world crowded with ideas, crowded with people, crowded with stuff. And so it means that those avenues of interaction can sometimes be a bit limited, or they can be very highly managed, or they're facilitated in certain modes. But perhaps in a world where that facilitation is much more ideological, I think that that's probably the motivating reason. And I don't personally think it's with the intention of control. This is where we get into those co-domestic spheres. We get into those ideas of the animal being part of the sort of the greater household embedded in the landscape. The humans' dwellings embedded in the landscape, and these animals are also part of that greater home. So again, I suppose it's unpacking. Did someone actually think one day, wake up in the morning, and go, "Oh, you know what? I'm going to jump at that animal. This is going to be a great idea." Hopefully I won't die, but people are going to think I'm cool. Imagine all the fist bumps I'll get, all the likes. Oh wait, likes didn't exist back then, or did they? But I think when you start looking at it that way, you see that actually, does that hold up to scrutiny? A lot of these animals, when you're looking in various cultures throughout time, and if you're looking at in North America, looking at the Blackfoot nations, primarily they take on a spiritual purpose. Yes, even the dog before the introduction of the horse, or should I say reintroduction of the horse, had a practical use, but it was still a revered animal. But then when the horse comes in, very quickly, within a decade or two, it's suddenly taken on all of these roles in society. So I kind of wonder if veneration is probably a really important aspect of this, not just what can we extract from it. And that extractive approach to things, I think, is something that's developed over our current few hundred years of development in society. And the efficiency, the mechanization, the productivity, the things that we can get from nature to improve our world. But if you perceived nature or the natural world as perfect already in itself, are you going out there to improve it? Is domestication about improving the animal? I mean, these are some of the thoughts coming up in the Enlightenment thinking in the 1800s. Go out and find an animal, see if it's useful for society, take it back, let's give it a go. If not, that's it. Someone can cook it on a barbecue or whatever. But these days, I don't think we need to look back at that, because our priorities are different, right? We don't think that that's important, but then we're abusing animals today, right? So it's still under there. It's still underlying the very foundations of our society, is that relationship with it. The idea of the human being separate from the natural world and then coming into it to perfect it.
So I think you make a really important point there, actually, is that you need to have that reflexivity about history. I think a lot of us take for granted, and I think a lot of us think as well, that a lot of facts in history are definitive, and that we all come away with an idea that this is what happened, this is why it happened, bish bash bosh, that's it. But there's a lot of different factors and a lot of different potential answers, like you're bringing about with the reason for domestication of horses across different places, is that there's different reasons, and we can't be sure of those reasons because we weren't there for all of these interactions. But talking about domestication, and we are looking at you're making a great point about putting today's values onto the values of the past. But you're also talking about some of the issues that someone might have. What issues did these people have with attempting to tame, train, and domesticate horses? Because whilst not a lot of people have gotten very close to a horse, we can respect the size and the power of these beings, because a lot of them are 2-3 times taller than an average person, and a good deal heavier. So what issues did they have?
I can speak from personal experience, actually. A couple of years ago, so I can't remember where I was at, but there was a bunch of wild ponies, and they were sort of roaming around. I was going for a hike, and I don't know why. I just thought, I've done a little bit of reading around things. Okay, yeah, Granddad said these things before. I mean, he passed away before I was born, but he said these things to Mum about how you do things, or whatever. So I thought, okay, let's try and make some friends here. So I tried to insert myself in the herd, right? Become one with the herd. And I think it was over a couple of days. So I sort of brought things. I brought the bits of fruit, apple, carrot, whatever. And I sort of just tried observing the different animals in the herd. I thought, okay, some of these horses are a bit young, some of them are a bit older. I can see that's possibly the lead mare. And I think that there was only some sort of young males in it. So that was kind of that was a reassuring thing, because obviously if you have a stallion in the herd, it can be a bit problematic in a wild one. And then after some time, I sort of started to see some of them were a bit more calmer than others. So I tried getting a bit closer to them, stroking them on the nose, letting them smell me, letting them have the agency as well to come to me. So it was a bit boring sometimes, just sort of sitting there watching. And anyway, to cut a long story short, after some time, I eventually sort of decided upon this one horse, and I thought, aha, okay, this is the one. Here we go. All right, matey. Let's see what happens. So, again, trying to get close to it, trying to get round the side of the animal. Again, it's about sort of reassuring the horse that you're not a threat, and sort of trying to mimic those herd behaviors as well. But anyway, so I sort of, leant up against it, getting it used to my touch and everything. After some time, I managed to actually put my entire body weight over it and sort of was just sort of resting over it like that. And then it was sort of just a bit placid. It was like, okay, that's cool. All right, got off, tried a few more times. And then the next day I thought, okay, let's be a bit more daring. So then did the sort of same process again. And then I got to that stage of putting my body weight and I thought, okay, let's get a leg over. I'm probably sure there's many people listening to this thinking, what an idiot. But anyway, so I got leg over, not in that way. But so I'm on this horse and again, just sort of trying to very gently move my body weight onto it. So not like a plonk, just plonking yourself. So I'm on this horse, and it sort of just stopped breathing. And it's like, and I could feel the tension in its muscles underneath me. And I'm like, okay. Right, this might not end well. So then after, I think it was probably about good 20, 30 seconds. I was just sort of very gently on it, just sort of gently stroking the side of it, and then suddenly it just kicked out from underneath me. I wish someone had seen it because I literally got knocked off. I don't know if you've done martial arts, but I ended up landing in horse stance on my legs like this. Wow, that was quite scary. Literally got bucked off the end. And then I thought, okay, I'll persist. So then the next day I tried again. And then this time I really it was like a bucking kind of, sort of like cowboy kind of thing. I really got thrown off. And I think it was probably about by round 3, and I was already having to sort of leave where I was staying. And then I discovered that, okay, this is going to take a long time. Anyway, the long story short is, that's my personal experience from horses today that aren't necessarily wild. These are probably sort of offshoots from a domestic breed from some time ago. But in terms of approaching a horse, I mean, there's a very, very good book, Monty Roberts, The Man Who Listens to Horses. I mean, there's probably things in there which you do have to, he's very much about intuition, right? He's very much about being in the mind and the body and being present within yourself and having that sort of calm, assertive energy. And it's probably not what every academic would go on about. It's maybe a bit more left field, as they would say. But it's certainly stuff that works. I mean, he's managed to do it with deer, and deer is a far more skittish animal than horse. And his process was, again, slowly getting used to the herd, observing them. And it was at night that he managed to notice that a lot of the herd interactions actually occurred as opposed to the day. That's when you'd see the lead mare, dishing out discipline to the younger ones when they weren't behaving, that it's the lead mare holding most of that discipline. And it's the stallion that then does more of the protective activities during the day or even the night when there's sort of predators attacking. But it's the mare that keeps that social cohesion. So that's where he managed to learn about the sociality of the horses. And these are wild Mustangs in North America. Now, going back, okay, long story, winding all the way back round. So if we're talking about the horses that are supposedly domesticated in Botai in northern Kazakhstan, not long ago, a genetic study came out now suggesting that these horses are not related to modern domesticates. These horses are closely related to the Przewalski horse, which is supposedly the last remaining wild horse, truly wild horse in the world. And that threw up a whole load of questions, right? So if this horse that they were riding is an ancestor of this modern Przewalski horse, then it means that this horse isn't truly what biologically you would define as a truly wild specimen. It's been domesticated at some point. But then that's on the premise that the horse was domesticated in the first place. So if the horse wasn't domesticated, but then people supposedly are riding them, what do you have? If you have evidence for riding but not domestication, what do you call it, right? That's the new term we need to figure out. But these are all the kinds of theories sort of floating around. This horse is, the Przewalski horse is renowned for being a stubborn horse. You cannot tame it. You cannot, it's a tricky one. Even in captivity, this is some time ago. They just weren't even breeding. There's certain different motions that have to be done in order for these types of horses to actually breed, and they just weren't breeding in captivity, so they had to be released. It's just their sociality, the way that they interact with each other, and the very sort of the processes and stages of that sociality, leading up to mating, leading up to whatever it is, are so important to horses that if you interrupt that cycle, you can get things that we call stereotypic behavior. Maybe biting, maybe sort of like things that aren't necessarily helpful if the animal is in your social remit, if you're riding it and taming it or whatever. So if these people were able to try, in the Western sense, domesticate a Przewalski horse or something similar to it, how could they do it without modern tackle, without all the different fittings and fixtures, without a fixed pen? Okay, there's post holes that are found in some of these sites in Botai, and some have suggested that there's possible remains of organic remains, maybe resembling dung or something like that. Perhaps these are corrals where they were trained or contained in. But a post hole can also just be a post hole. Could be anything. So when you come back to how were these horses domesticated, I think you've got to ask how might they have been tamed. And that's where you come into natural horsemanship techniques. So things like what Monty Roberts has been experimenting with for decades, what Pat Pirelli has been experimenting with for decades as well. These methods of utilizing natural horse behavior, maybe using a few things, maybe a rope, maybe a few little gizmos, but in the open air. Yeah, you might have a corral as well. Monty Roberts has managed to do it outside of a corral as well. It takes time, but not as long as you think. I think maybe within like 3 or 4 hours, some of these horses that are supposedly wild or untamed have been tamed by Pirelli and Roberts. Even Roberts has managed to tame a wild Mustang, in I think that was like 3 days, 4 days as well. So it's actually far shorter than your conventional methods that we use today, where it may take weeks to break in the animal. So what kinds of things are these people employing? What kinds of techniques, if they are indeed riding them? But the physical conformation of a Przewalski horse it's not sort of congenial to being ridden on. The shoulders, the placement of the shoulders, the placement of the spine, the whole physicality of the animal. It's a tricky thing that doesn't exactly resemble modern horses. So if you were to sit on its back, firstly, it wouldn't be very comfortable for the rider. Secondly, it wouldn't be very comfortable for the horse. And after some time, you would end up with some sorts of injuries, either to the rider or the horse, whether it's the vertebral damage, which some have suggested might be a great way of discovering if a horse has been ridden. But it certainly wouldn't be in the same placement as a modern horse. Not only that, it's more the soft tissue damage. It's the seat bones from your butt as they're going bouncing or rubbing on the back of the horse that will start doing damage to those dorsal muscles and the spine muscles and all of those areas along the shoulders. So it becomes a tricky animal once you start looking at it to actually domesticate in a conventional sense. So you kind of get left with this idea that the best way to tame or to sort of socialize with one of these Przewalski type horses is to use these natural horsemanship techniques. But you have to be very, very patient and with a very intricate knowledge of horse behavior of these herds in order to actually do anything with them in the Western sense. But I think the thing you've got to really pick apart is, domesticating an animal today is very different to what might have been back then. And if there's no evidence for, bridles, saddles, and all of that kind of stuff, then you're literally talking bare basics, if that. And that just brings up more questions. And I think that's where you then have to look at the culture. And that brings us all the way back to the archaeology. And I think for me, the point of archaeology, which is like just wanting to get into the heads of people in the past, the whys, the scary, squidgy questions that don't have the hard data necessarily. They don't have a dearth of hard data either. But it's the stuff that makes it meaningful. That's where you get to relate and how you get to understand. And sometimes looking at all of the different technological forms of domestication that utilize tools, that utilize edifices and buildings, can take us away, I think, from getting to the meaning of the why. And I think that's where, when you look at some of these spiritual approaches, which they are spiritual approaches to animals, that's where you can start to understand the why, and that's where you can see where they've been ritually buried, these horses, where you can see where they've been ritually treated, different aspects of the body that might have been more important than others and have been put in ritual contexts with other human beings and such like. That's where you see that there is meaning behind it. So sometimes I wonder if looking for domestication is our modern hang-up that might not be what their initial intention was 5,000 years ago.
I think you made some really good, really nice distinctions there for us as well as historians. Is you're making that distinction between traditional Western views on how we treat animals and what our relationship with animals is, and then that distinction between domestication and taming, because the two are very different, and it's an important distinction to probably keep in mind throughout all of these interactions. Is if you put a traditional modern Western lens on these things that we're looking at, it can often skew how we view these relationships from the past and these interactions in the past. But you gave me a great segue with the end of your answer there about archaeology, and within your paper you discuss archaeological and scientific findings quite a bit and in great detail, and you started to touch on it a little bit there. How helpful has archaeology and scientific findings been in helping us to explore the interactions between humans and horses and their lives together in Central Eurasia?
I think that's a really good point to cover, really, because without that, I mean, this is where it is that composite, holistic approach. Without that hard stuff, you don't have anything firm to jump off from, right? But if you don't jump, then you're never going to get to the other side. Sometimes you can't build a bridge. Sometimes you've got to take a leap. I think of that scene in Indiana Jones, right? Where he's got to take the leap from the lion's head or whatever. In terms of the archaeology in Central Asia, yeah, there's quite a lot of really interesting findings. Various sites that have tons and tons of horse bones, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of horse bones. Bortai is one example. You've got Khvalinsk as well. That's an earlier cemetery. And you see different uses of them. So you can see where they've been perhaps hunted, and where you see these large agglomerations of the bones. And then you see where they've been buried in particular burials with a certain individual. And you'll see the phalanges, the toe bits, the toe bones, or you'll see the horse skull. That's a very, very interesting thing, because the horse skull is still something very important to modern Mongolian herders, certainly in the Arkhangai province. It's still revered as probably the most important aspect of the animal after it's died. And so when you see those similarities there as well, again, similarities, not the same, you can see that there is a meaning there, a spiritual meaning, and it's probably not the same meaning, but you can certainly see that someone's gone to the effort of doing it. I mean, even in Derivka, so this is in Ukraine, there's suggestions again of ritual treatment, certainly of dogs. It's interesting as well, where sometimes you find dogs, you certainly can find horses. But yeah, those material findings are the things that really emphasize a ritual treatment. And I think it's that ritual treatment that can tend to get overlooked. The fact that it has been ritually treated is sometimes more important than the things you can't find that you expect to find when you're looking for domestication. So sometimes I wonder if we weren't to look for domestication, we might see a lot more. Um, and when you then look at these other societies in North America, the Blackfoot, even if you look at northern Siberia with these reindeer herders, you see that it's that kind of ritual treatment that actually takes precedence over all the practical stuff. And if you're finding it in these sites, I think it's probably uh, a disservice if you're just going to ignore that and put that aside. When it comes to genetics, I think I mentioned the study on the horses from Botai. There's a lot of evidence suggesting multiple ghost lineages now. Ghost lineages, horses that we don't have physical or direct evidence of existing, but through tracing, genealogy back, and I mean, doing all the sort of complicated stuff that they do in Jurassic Park, extracting things into things. Then you see that there's vast herds and different sort of offshoots of horses throughout Eurasia, certainly in Siberia, that have existed but aren't present necessarily at these sites. But they're within the same time frame. So they're within maybe a couple of 100 years of some of these other horse bones in northern Kazakhstan, or certainly within the 1,000 years of those sort of interactions with horses. That kind of helps you to pinpoint that there's more possibilities, right? We're looking at Dom2 horses, they're referred to DOM2, the modern domesticates. We're looking for things that we can compare with that. But there's so many different types that have existed throughout history that it's just fascinating to think all the different types of interactions that could have happened. There's some suggestions that the way reindeers were first tamed, I'll say, rather than domesticated, in northern Siberia is from the inspiration of seeing how horses were in Mongolia. And even in Mongolia, reindeer being tamed as well is another thing that might have helped with some of those interactions in Siberia. But again, some of these developments are also unique to the region, and I think that's where getting a finger on culture, getting a finger on the pulse of the mindset of those people, I think that's where you get to understand how these sorts of things evolve separately.
No, I think you made a great point, actually. It stresses the need to decentralize, move away the narrative from a traditional European Christian centric worldview of how certain processes and interactions have occurred. Because through your study looking at Central Eurasia, this is an area where communities and societies were traditionally nomadic, and they were non-Christian. So decentralizing that narrative creates an endless possibility of how these interactions might have been and their uses in society. But Aaron, I have a final fun question for you, as we do for everyone on the podcast. And I like to show historians as not just boring people who sit in our rooms and in libraries and study and sit in cafes and write nothing all day. We actually have lives, and you certainly have a very exciting one, because you're an actor and a voiceover artist as well as being a historian. How has being an actor and voiceover artist helped you in being a historian?
Well, this is a very fascinating question to answer, because I think for me they're both integral. They they feed each other. I think it's the imagination you gain from the creative industry that helps you to bring these things to life. Otherwise, you're just reading these things, right? A lot of the stuff we get is just written word, and God forbid it's all numbers and weird and squiggles and dots. Those papers are the most interesting. But I think for me, it's really helped me to appreciate how using both the sort of the creative and the intellectual side together really helps you to sort of get context. So when you're utilizing the creative side with the intellectual side, you get to see the context, and the context is the thing that really binds everything together. Otherwise, it is just loose bits of data on a page. It's like a building that's just a pile of bricks. When does a pile of bricks become a building? When you stick it together with meaning, right? And I think that's the context that I think we're all looking for in the past. The things that then we can understand ourselves better with today, the things we can relate to, the things we can appreciate, and appreciate our own context and history today. And so, the acting world, sometimes I find when historical narratives are being portrayed, they can be a little bit, one-dimensional or two-dimensional. They can sort of feed into one aspect of it, but not the rest. And like for me when I was a kid, I don't know for yourself, but some of these things are the first things you watch, right? And they're the things that really interest you, even if they're maybe not entirely accurate, but they're visual, and I think we learn visually. We're reading stuff all the time, right? But it's when we see things that are moving in a pictorial way, I think that can really go into us a lot deeper. When we hear those things, if we can, tangibly touch it and smell it. These are the things that I think how stories were moved on and on throughout generations over thousands of years, telling them around different situations in banquet halls, over fires, and different social circumstances. But today it can sometimes be condensed to a book, which is a great way of distilling the information. But then you've got to make it alive again, right? You've got to make it relevant in some way. And so for me, I think I'm really interested in seeing how the creative world can take that material accurately, and give it all the due, respect and stuff that it deserves, and turn that into a visual or sensory spectacle that encourages people to be more interested in the past.
I think that's a really nice and nicest way, emotional way of bringing history to people, and it's definitely something that I've found throughout some of the books that I've got is lacking in the way that we interact with history, and it's possibly somewhere where living historians are trying to bring that to the fray a little bit more. And it's great to hear you wanting to and using two parts of your life to bring history to life a little bit more, because as someone who plays sport, it definitely informs the way that I look and approach history as well. And it's always great to hear how historians are more than just historians as well.
What kind of sport do you play?
I was a rugby player, so
wow.
Yeah.
And you must have watched the final then recently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but I wasn't, after South Africa beat us, I wasn't particularly fussed, but
That's
I wanted
fair
New
enough.
Zealand to win. Yeah.
Yeah, so did I actually. I think that's that. It's always interesting to see how you can, mix those two things up as well, to sort of give you, the physical side of things as well. These are all aspects of the past. People are living a physical life, and I sometimes wonder that in the modern world we are encouraged to be in one aspect, to be maybe either pigeonholed or to be driven to just be in one thing. But that doesn't lead you to become a rounded person. It doesn't also help you to understand those people in the past. And that physical aspect of things, I think, is a great way of understanding how, physicality, through whether it's warfare or social interactions and sports over the time, has actually been so important to history and civilizations. And I think, like, certainly for me with the acting world as well, this is all the sorts of things that make it worth finding out, right? It makes it worth living for, and it keeps our interest in it.
No, I think that's a wonderful point there. I think that's a wonderful point. But obviously, our listeners are going to want to go away, find you, and interact with you online, Aaron. Where can they find you?
All right, you can find me on Instagram at Arun Daniel Sharma. My short film, which will be coming out probably in the next couple of months, we've got a lot of post-production to do. That is a historical narrative set in the early Middle Ages, following one man's pilgrimage to a certain church in the countryside. And yeah, that'll be up and running. I think I'll keep you posted about that when it comes out. But yeah, I've got my website, my actor's website is being currently under construction when it's being developed again. kind of needed to sort of change a few things up. But that's www.arundaniel.com. Yeah, so you can find me. Yeah,
I'll make sure those are in the description for our listeners to go and interact with and find you. So thank you very much for coming on, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. It's been great to chat.
Now, I really hope that you enjoyed this episode with Arun, all about his paper, Redefining Eneolithic Human-Horse Interactions in Central Eurasia. There was an awful lot going on in that conversation, and I learned so much about the different methods of taming and domesticating horses, and learned even more about the importance of archaeology, but also of science within our study of history. Now, if you enjoyed this episode or any of the other ones that we have produced, please do consider supporting us through the Buy Me a Coffee profile in the description below, or History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts. Next week we have another awesome episode lined up, and I know you're going to enjoy that one, so I'll see you all next week.